There are moments that change your life. For me, it wasn't a graduation or a promotion. It was standing in the shadows of my own home, at 32 years old, and realizing my parents' love was conditional, so I decided to do the only thing I could disappear completely and prove them wrong on a scale they could never imagine. This is the story of how I turned the deepest hurt into my greatest strength. If you know what it feels like to be underestimated, stick around. The air in my brother's new house was thick with the scent of money. It wasn't just the expensive floral arrangements or the catered hors d'oeuvres. It was something more fundamental. Woven into the very drywall of the Lake Forest mansion, it was the smell of effortless success, a fragrance I had never been able to wear myself. I tugged at the hem of my silk dress, a costume I'd bought for the occasion that felt 2 sizes too small for my soul. Around me, conversations buzzed a low hum of stock portfolios, vacation homes, and private school admissions. I was an island in a sea of my family's expectations, and the tide was rising. My father, Richard, tapped a crystal champagne flute with a spoon, the clear ring silencing the room. He stood in the center of the cavernous living room, his arm draped proudly around my older brother. Ethan, Mom, Helen, stood beside them, beaming as if she herself had laid every brick of this house. I just want to say a few words. Dad began, his voice smooth and practiced, the kind he used to close multi-million-dollar deals. We couldn't be prouder of Ethan. He sets a goal, and he achieves it. He has vision, acumen. He's a true Henderson. He paused for effect, his eyes sweeping the crowd of rapt faces before landing, briefly, on me. It wasn't a look of inclusion, it was a look of assessment, of comparison. As always, I was the control group in the experiment of my family. Then, he produced an envelope from his jacket pocket. So, to help you get started on this next chapter. Son, your mother and I wanted to give you a little something. He handed the envelope to Ethan. My brother, ever the gracious golden child, opened it with a performance of mild surprise. Though we all knew this was coming, he pulled out the check. Even from across the room, I could see the zeros. My father leaned into the microphone a guest had handed him and announced, $230,000. The room erupted in applause. I clapped along, the sound of my palms hitting each other feeling distant and hollow. I forced a smile, my facial muscles aching from the effort. It was a scene I'd watched in different forms my whole life, Ethan's victory, sponsored and celebrated by our parents. While I stood in the wings, it was always like this. The applause for Ethan sent a jolt through my memory, transporting me back to our childhood backyard. I was maybe 9 years old, holding up a small pot with a trembling bean sprout poking through the soil. My hands still caked with dirt. I'd run to show my father, my heart thumping with pride. At the same moment, Ethan, 12, was showing off the new, professional-grade baseball bat they'd bought him after he hit a home run. Dad ruffled Ethan's hair, his voice booming with pride. That's my slugger. Then he glanced at my pot, his nose wrinkling slightly. Go wash your hands, Bailey, he'd said, his attention already back on the gleaming wood of the bat. Baseball builds character. Dirt just makes a mess. Back in the present, a hand touched my arm, pulling me from the memory. It was my Aunt Carol. Bailey, dear, it's been too long, she said, her smile genuine but her eyes filled with a familiar, polite confusion. So, are you still doing your little gardening thing? For that charity? Before I could answer, my mother was there, gliding in like a hawk spotting a field mouse. Oh, Carol. Bailey's work is so admirable, Mom said, her voice dripping with practiced sweetness. She patted my arm, a gesture that was meant to look like affection but felt like a correction. She helps underprivileged communities grow their own vegetables. It's such a lovely, charitable hobby. Hobby? The word landed like a stone in my gut. I had a degree in environmental science. I was a project manager. I designed and implemented vertical growing systems that fed hundreds of people, but in my mother's world, if it didn't come with a six-figure salary and a corner office, it was a hobby. Speaking of careers, Mon continued, effortlessly pivoting. Did you hear Ethan is up for another promotion vice president before 35? We think. He's a natural leader, just like his father. She steered Aunt Carol away, leaving me alone again. Her words were a pinprick, and they deflated me, sending my thoughts tumbling back to the one person who had ever understood. My grandma Eleanor. I could almost feel the warmth of her hand, tough and calloused, holding mine. I saw us in her sprawling, chaotic garden, the air thick with the smell of tomato leaves and damp earth. She was the one who taught me that soil wasn't dirt, it was life. Don't let anyone tell you that creating life from the earth is small. She'd told me just before she passed away. Her voice a frail whisper. Your father. He's a good man. But he measures the world with a ruler made of dollar bills. Not everyone does. She'd gripped my hand tighter. Promise me you'll follow your heart. Bailey. Don't make the same mistake of living for someone else's approval. I had promised, and I was trying to keep that promise, but it was hard when the world I came from kept telling me my heart was wrong. A few hours passed in a blur of small talk and feigned interest. Finally, the crowd began to thin. I decided it was time to make my escape. I headed towards the front of the house to find my coat, which was in a small den off the main hallway. As I reached for it, I heard my parents' voices coming from my father's new home office across the hall. The door was slightly ajar. It was a wonderful party. Richard, my mother said, her voice softer now. Tired. It was. My father agreed. A pause. Then, his voice dropped to a low, conspiratorial murmur, the kind that was never meant to be overheard. I worry about her. Helen. Ethan is set. He's on the right path. But Bailey. She's 32 years old and she's still playing in the mud. I just don't know where we went wrong. My mother sighed. A long, weary sound. She's just different. She's a failure, my father stated. It wasn't said with anger. It was worse. It was said with the calm, quiet finality of a diagnosis. A fact. My blood ran cold. I stood frozen in the hallway, my coat halfway off the hook. Failure. The word echoed in the sudden, roaring silence of my mind. It wasn't a new thought. I had felt it in their dismissive glances and lukewarm praise for years, but to hear it spoken so plainly, so brutally, shattered something deep inside me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I heard them move on to another topic, their voices fading as they walked deeper into the house. I slowly, carefully, placed my coat back on the hook. I turned and walked out the front door, closing it silently behind me. I didn't say goodbye. The drive back to my tiny studio apartment was a blur. I operated on autopilot, my mind a blank slate of shock. I unlocked my door, stepped inside. and was enveloped by the familiar scent of potting soil and green things growing on my windowsill, the smell of my failure. I sat on my couch in the dark, the city lights painting stripes across the floor. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I felt a strange and terrifying calm settle over me. For 32 years, I had been trying to earn my place at a table where I was never truly welcome. I had been playing a game with rules designed for me to lose. With a slow, deliberate movement, I reached for my phone. The screen lit up my face. I opened my contacts and scrolled down to Dad. My thumb hovered over his name. I thought of his voice. The pride when he spoke of Ethan. The clinical disappointment when he spoke of me. I pressed and held. A menu appeared. Delete contact. My thumb moved, pressing the confirmation without hesitation. He was gone. I scrolled up to Mom. I thought of her practiced smiles. Her constant, subtle steering of every conversation back to my brother's successes. Her framing of my life's work as a quaint hobby. I deleted her contact. Then I scrolled to Ethan. I loved my brother. But he was a part of their world. The sun their planets revolved around. He would never understand. I deleted his contact. 2. I turned the phone off and set it on the table beside me. The screen went black, plunging the room back into darkness. The silence was absolute. It should have been terrifying. The silence of being completely cut off from the only family I had ever known. But it wasn't. For the first time in my life, I was completely alone. And for the first time, that felt like freedom. A single, hot tear finally escaped and traced a path down my cheek. Not of sadness, but of release. The morning after was the quietest I had ever known. The sun streamed through the window of my studio, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, each one a tiny, silent planet in its own universe. For the first time in my adult life, my phone did not light up with a good morning text from my mother. There was no missed call from my father about a news article he thought I should read, which was always, invariably, about finance. The silence wasn't just an absence of sound, it was a presence, a heavy, expansive thing that filled every corner of my small apartment. It was the sound of a slate wiped clean. For the first few days, that silence was a balm. I went to my job at Urban Harvest, the nonprofit where I managed community gardens, and poured every ounce of my being into the soil. I sank my fingers deep into the cool, dark earth, feeling the grit under my nails, and imagined I was burying the ghost of my father's word, failure. With every weed I pulled, every seed I planted, I fought against it. The physical labor exhausted my body and quieted my mind. In the evenings, I'd come home, eat a simple meal, and read until my eyes grew heavy. The phone remained dark, a silent black rectangle on my nightstand. But after a week, the silence began to change its shape. It grew teeth, loneliness, a familiar acquaintance, moved in and became a roommate. I'd be washing dishes and find myself reaching for my phone to tell my mom about a funny thing that happened at the garden, only to have my hand freeze halfway, the phantom limb of our relationship aching. One night, a wave of crippling self-doubt washed over me so intensely I almost choked on it. Was this a mistake? Had I been rash? Childish. I had orphaned myself over a single word. My thumb hovered over the keypad. The muscle memory of my father's number, a ghost in my nerves. I could fix this. I could call. Apologize for what? For hearing the truth. The thought was so absurd it shocked me back to reality. I threw the phone onto my couch as if it were hot and took a ragged breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. No, I would not go back. That resolve pushed me deeper into my work. The project that had consumed me for months was a new modular vertical growing tower. The existing models were good, but they were inefficient with water and didn't allow for varied light exposure. I spent my lunches sketching new irrigation patterns, my evenings researching hydroponic nutrient flows. I became obsessed. It was a problem I could solve, a system I could control. Unlike the complex and broken ecosystem of my own family. Then one afternoon, I figured it out. A tiered, gravity-fed drip system combined with a central rotating axis. It was simple, elegant, and it would cut water usage by 40% while increasing yield by at least 20%. I built a prototype in our small workshop. Using salvaged PVC pipes and a small motor, when I finally switched it on, watching the water trickle perfectly from level to level as the tower slowly spun, a feeling of pure, unadulterated triumph surged through me. It was a victory that was entirely my own. My supervisor, a pragmatic woman named Maria, came to see it. She stared at the contraption for a long moment, her arms crossed. "Bailey," she said slowly, a smile spreading across her face. "What have you done?" I think I've fixed the water problem," I said, my voice unsteady. "Honey," she replied, laughing, "you've done a hell of a lot more than that." That small breakthrough was a foothold. It was a piece of evidence, tangible and real, that I could show to the phantom jury in my head. See, I'm not a failure. I can build things. But the world has a funny way of testing you right when you feel you're getting stronger. A few weeks later, Maria called an all-hands meeting. The atmosphere was tense. A major city grant we had been counting on had fallen through. Budgets had to be slashed. As Maria went through the list of programs facing cuts, my stomach sank. My vertical farming project, still in its pilot phase, was at the top of the list. It was deemed non-essential. The word felt like a slap. I spent the next 2 days in a frenzy, fueled by cheap coffee and a burning sense of injustice. I wasn't just fighting for a project. I was fighting for the only part of my life that currently made sense. I compiled data, created charts, and wrote a passionate proposal outlining not just the cost savings of the new design, but its potential for expansion, its ability to empower the communities we served. I was defending my own worth all over again. The night before I was due to present my case to the board, an email landed in my inbox. The sender's name made my heart skip a beat. Dr. Evelyn Reed. She had been my favorite professor in college, a brilliant botanist who had first encouraged my unpractical passion. The subject line read, "Saw this and thought of you." Inside was a link to a small local news article about urban harvest, with a picture of me standing next to one of my garden beds. The email itself was short. "Bailey, it fills me with such pride to see you doing this work. I read about your community programs and I wanted to reach out. I always knew you had a gift for seeing the world not just as it is, but as it could be. Let's catch up soon. Evelyn." I stared at the words, reading them over and over. Tears welled in my eyes, hot and sudden. It was the validation I had been starving for, coming from a voice I respected, a voice that had always seen potential where my family had only seen dirt. The next day, armed with a newfound confidence, I presented my case to the board. I spoke not just about numbers, but about purpose. I defended my project, and they agreed to give it a 6-month extension. That afternoon, I called Professor Reed. Her voice was just as warm and intelligent as I remembered. We talked for an hour, And as I told her about my new tower design, I could hear the excitement growing in her voice. "Bailey, this is remarkable," she said. "You're not just growing vegetables. You're building a system. You know, there's someone I think you should meet. He's an investor, a former student of mine. But he's different. He's interested in agricultural technology. His name is David Chen." A week later, I found myself in a sleek, minimalist coffee shop downtown. A place that felt more like my father's world than mine. I clutched my presentation folder, my palms sweating. David Chen was sharp, dressed in a casual but obviously expensive sweater. And he listened with an unnerving stillness. I was terrified. I felt like a fraud. A girl who played in the mud trying to speak the language of money and business. But then he asked me a question. Why this? Why not something more profitable? And just like that, the fear dissolved. He wasn't asking about my business model. He was asking about my passion. I started talking, and the words just flowed. I spoke of food deserts, of community empowerment, of the simple dignity of growing your own food. I spoke of my grandmother's garden. I explained the science behind my vertical towers with the same passion I felt when I was building them. I forgot he was an investor. I was just a woman talking about the things she loved most. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, just looking at me. "Your parents must be incredibly proud," he said. The words were a gut punch. I just shook my head. A small, involuntary motion. "They don't really get it," I managed to say. He nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. "Then they're missing the point," he said. He leaned forward. "What you have here, Bailey, is more than a non-profit project. It's a scalable solution. Non-profit is good, but profit can scale your impact exponentially. It can get this technology into the hands of thousands, not hundreds." He paused, letting the idea sink in. "I want to help you build a company. I'm prepared to offer an initial seed investment of $75,000. $75,000. The number hung in the air, seeming to shimmer. It was more money than I had ever seen. It was an opportunity. A door swinging open to a world I never thought I could enter. And it was terrifying. I walked home in a daze, his offer replaying in my mind. This was the ultimate crossroads. I could stay in the safe, familiar world of urban harvest, doing good work that I loved. Or I could take this leap. I could risk everything, my savings, my career, my sanity, on the belief that my hobby was actually a viable business. My father's voice was a venomous whisper in my ear. Failure. What if he was right? What if I took this money and lost it all? It would be the ultimate proof that I was exactly what he thought I was. I got back to my apartment and stood in front of my windowsill, looking at the thriving line of herbs and small plants I kept there. I touched the leaf of a basil plant, its fragrant scent rising to meet me. And then I heard another voice, a whisper from long ago, warm and kind. "Promise me you'll follow your heart, Bailey." My heart was here, in the soil, in the act of creation. It was in the system I had designed. My father was wrong. My grandmother was right. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. I met with lawyers, signed incorporation papers that officially gave birth to Vertical Bloom. The name came to me one morning, a symbol of growth in unexpected places. Then came the hardest part. I gave my 2 weeks' notice at Urban Harvest. Leaving Maria and the community I'd built was a wrenching, bittersweet moment. They threw me a small party, and I promised to partner with them in the future. And then, it was real. I used a portion of the investment to lease a small, empty warehouse space that would be my first office and workshop. The night after I got the keys, I stood alone in the cavernous room. The smell of fresh paint and concrete was sharp in the air. My footsteps echoed. The only sound in the vast emptiness, there was no team yet. No products. Just a bank account. A blueprint. And me. The full, crushing weight of what I had done finally landed on me. I slid down the wall and sat on the cold concrete floor. My head in my hands. What have I done? What if he was right? What if I am a failure? Just as the despair began to feel absolute, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A new email. I pulled it out, my hands trembling slightly. My heart stopped. The subject line read, "Inquiry regarding in-store vertical farming systems." The sender, Regional Grocers Incorporated. They were one of the biggest grocery chains in the Midwest. It was a long shot. A make-or-break opportunity that had arrived before I was even remotely ready. I looked around the empty warehouse. Then back at the glowing screen. The race had just begun. The ping of the email echoed in the vast, empty warehouse. A tiny sound against the backdrop of my hammering heart. For a long moment, I just stared at the screen. The words Regional Grocers Incorporated seeming to float in the darkness. My self-doubt, which had been a crushing weight just seconds before, didn't vanish. Instead, it was consumed by a tidal wave of pure, terrifying adrenaline. This wasn't a test anymore. This was the game. The next 2 years of my life didn't unfold day by day. They happened in a single, sustained, caffeine-fueled hurricane. My response to that email led to a meeting. I walked into a boardroom that smelled of polished wood and stale coffee. The kind of room I'd always associated with my father's world. I was surrounded by men in identical gray suits. Their faces impassive. The old me would have shrunk. Would have apologized for taking up space. But as I set up my laptop, I looked at their faces and I didn't see a jury. I saw a field of unplowed earth, ready for planting. I spoke for an hour, and my voice never wavered. They awarded Vertical Bloom a pilot program contract for 3 of their flagship stores. The work that followed was brutal. I hired my first 2 employees. A recent horticulture grad named Sarah and a retired engineer named Ben, who could build anything out of anything. The 3 of us worked 80-hour weeks. I was on my hands and knees on the cold tile floors of grocery stores at 3 in the morning, covered in grease and PVC glue, running wiring until my fingers were raw and my back screamed in protest. There were moments of near disaster, a pump that failed, a batch of lettuce that wilted under the wrong LED lights, a budget spreadsheet that told me we were 2 weeks from being completely broke. In those dark moments, the whisper of my father's voice returned. Failure. But this time, there was a new voice that answered it. My own. Raw and exhausted but stubborn. Not yet. And then, it started to work. The first tower we installed, right by the entrance of a store in downtown Chicago, became an attraction. People would stop and stare, mesmerized by the sight of vibrant green lettuce and herbs growing right there in the middle of the city. Sales of the produce from that tower tripled the store's projections. My technology wasn't just a novelty, it was profitable. That one success became a lever. I wrote a press release, and a local business journal picked it up. That article was read by a restaurant supplier. That supplier led to a contract with a chain of high-end farm-to-table restaurants. The phone started ringing. My 2 employees became 5. Then 10. Then 15. Our empty warehouse was now a humming center of activity, filled with the sounds of saws, drills, and laughter. We were building. innovating, growing. I changed. 2. It wasn't something I did consciously. One morning, I looked in the mirror and realized I was standing up straighter. The apologetic slump in my shoulders was gone. I had stopped buying clothes that helped me blend into the background and started wearing what was practical and felt good, sturdy boots, comfortable jeans, and shirts with the sleeves already rolled up. I cut my hair. I learned to speak with an economy of words in negotiations, to hold my ground, to trust my own expertise. I hadn't realized how much space my family's disapproval had taken up in my head until it was gone, leaving a vast, quiet space for my own confidence to grow. 2 years after that first email, Vertical Bloom was not just surviving, it was thriving. I had paid back David Chen's initial investment with interest and was finally, truly profitable, and I knew exactly what I needed to do. It was a dream I'd held since I was a little girl in my grandma's garden. A dream so precious I'd barely dared to speak it aloud. I started looking for land. I spent every weekend driving out of the city, away from the concrete and steel, and into the rolling green hills of McHenry County. I looked at a dozen properties, but none of them felt right. Then, one crisp autumn afternoon, my realtor took me down a long, gravel road to a place that had been on the market for years. It was 40 acres of overgrown fields and tangled woods, with a dilapidated farmhouse and a big, bright, beautiful barn whose roof was sagging in the middle. I got out of the car, and I could just feel it. The place was breathing. I walked out into the middle of a field, the tall grass whispering around my knees. I smelled the wild mint and the rich, damp earth. This wasn't just land. It was a promise. It was the physical manifestation of my grandmother's legacy and my own silent rebellion. I could see it all, the farmhouse restored, the barn converted into a state-of-the-art research and development workshop, the fields used for testing new, large-scale systems. This was it. This was home. I made an offer that day. The next 6 months were a different kind of work. It was work fueled by joy. I oversaw the renovations, my hands covered in paint and sawdust instead of soil. I found a deep satisfaction in bringing the old farmhouse back to life. Choosing colors, sanding floors, planting a small garden out back just for myself. The barn was transformed into a laboratory of gleaming stainless steel and glowing purple LED lights, a perfect fusion of nature and technology. It was my sanctuary, the one place on earth I felt completely and utterly myself. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late summer when my two worlds collided. I was out near the newly restored barn, wearing my favorite work boots and a faded t-shirt, my hands dirty, laughing with Sarah about a new hybrid tomato she was developing. That's when I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. I looked up, expecting a delivery truck. Instead, I saw a pristine, silver BMW sedan, the kind my father drove, the kind that looked alien and out of place against the rustic backdrop of my farm. The engine cut off, and the driver's side door opened. My brother, Ethan, stepped out. He looked thinner than I remembered, and there were shadows under his eyes. He stood there by his car, staring, his mouth slightly open. For a full minute, I didn't move. He just took it all in: the restored white farmhouse, the massive red barn with the new Vertical Bloom sign elegantly lettered on its side, the neat rows of experimental crops in the fields beyond. The sheer scale of it. I felt a cold wall of ice snap into place around my heart. I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked towards him slowly. My posture straight, my face unreadable. Sarah gave me a questioning look and discreetly retreated into the barn. Ethan, I said. My voice was even, betraying nothing. You're a long way from the city. Bailey, he breathed, his voice hoarse. He took a few steps forward, his expensive leather shoes looking ridiculous on the gravel. I was just driving. I got lost. He gestured vaguely at the sign. Is this all yours? It is, I said. No smile. No invitation. Just a fact. He took another few steps, his eyes scanning everything, a dawning horror and amazement on his face. He saw the new irrigation systems, the small team of employees working in the distance, the professional, thriving reality of it all. He finally looked back at me. Really looked at me. And his carefully composed golden child mask just crumbled. I don't understand, he whispered. We thought, Dad said you were struggling. Dad was wrong, I said, the words coming out colder than I intended. He flinched, and then something inside him seemed to break. His shoulders slumped, and he ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up. He's wrong about a lot of things, he said, his voice thick with a sudden, raw emotion that shocked me. I sit in an office for 60 hours a week, moving numbers around on a screen. I make a fortune, and I have never, not for one single day, felt as alive as you look right now. He looked from my face to the barn, to the fields, and back. I'm living his dream. Bailey. Not Mina. You built your own. He looked at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Dad was wrong about you, he said, his voice cracking. So wrong. You're not a failure. You've built something real here. It was the first time anyone from my family had ever said anything like it. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow, and I had to lock my knees to keep from stumbling. Overwhelmed. Ethan fumbled for his phone. He has to see this, he muttered. More to himself than to me. He has to understand. Before I could stop him, he had dialed and put the phone on speaker. A moment later, our father's clipped. Impatient voice filled the quiet country air. Ethan, I'm about to walk into a meeting. What is it? Forget the meeting, Ethan said, his voice shaking with a passionate intensity I had never heard from him before. I'm at Bailey's place. You need to listen to me. Bailey's place, Richard said, confused. Her apartment. No, not her apartment, Ethan said, almost laughing. Her farm. She has a 40-acre farm. Dad? With a company. A real, actual company. There are people working here. There are greenhouses and labs. You always talked about building something of value. Bailey did it. For real. Not on paper. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. Let me talk to her, my father finally said, his voice strained. Ethan looked at me, his eyes pleading, and held out the phone. The entire world seemed to shrink to that small, black object. It was everything I had ever wanted my father. Forced to confront my success. Ready to talk to me. The old Bailey, the broken little girl with the bean sprout, was screaming inside me to take it. But I wasn't her anymore. I was the woman who had built all of this. I looked at my brother's hopeful face, then at the phone in his hand, and I slowly, deliberately, shook my head. Ethan's face fell, but he seemed to understand. He brought the phone back to his ear. She's She's busy. Dad, I'll call you later. He hung up. The silence that descended was different now. It wasn't empty. It was filled with everything that had just happened. Ethan looked at me. And the way he looked at me had changed forever. The older brother looking at his lost little sister was gone. In his place was a man looking at an equal. With something that felt terrifyingly like respect. They're going to come, he said quietly. It wasn't a question. It was a fact. I didn't answer. I just nodded, turning my gaze from my brother to the horizon, where a line of dark clouds was gathering. I had built my sanctuary, my fortress. And now, the storm was on its way. Chắc chắn rồi. Đây là bản thảo đầy đủ cho chương cuối cùng của câu chuyện. Được viết để nối tiếp liền mạch từ chương trước. Tuân thủ tất cả các yêu cầu về cảm xúc, độ dài và cấu trúc của bạn. Ethan was right. They came. It wasn't a matter of if, but when. For a full week, an uneasy quiet settled over the farm. Every time a car turned down my gravel road, my heart would leap into my throat. A Pavlovian response I hated. I tried to lose myself in the work, calibrating nutrient drips and analyzing soil samples. But my focus was fractured. I was bracing for an impact, for the collision of the world I had escaped and the world I had built. Then, on a Saturday morning so bright and clear, it felt like a mockery. The storm arrived. It came in the form of a familiar black sedan, crawling down the driveway as if uncertain of the terrain. It parked. And for a long moment, no one got out. I watched from the newly painted porch of my farmhouse, a mug of coffee growing cold in my hands. I had instructed my team to carry on as usual, to ignore the visitors. This was my confrontation, not theirs. Finally, the doors opened. My father, Richard, emerged first, looking stiff and profoundly out of place in his tailored slacks and cashmere sweater. My mother, Helen, followed, clutching her purse like a shield. Her city heels sinking slightly into the gravel, they stood there, two immaculate statues in my world of living, breathing, untidy nature. I did not go to them. I stayed on the porch, my feet planted firmly on the wooden boards I had helped lay. I let them make the long walk to the house. As they approached, I could see the conflict in their faces, confusion, discomfort, and something I couldn't quite name, perhaps a reluctant awe. Bailey, my father said when they reached the bottom step. It wasn't a question or a greeting. It was just my name, hanging in the air. Hello, Dad, Mom, I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. I was wondering when you'd show up. An awkward silence stretched between us. It was my mother who broke it. Her voice tight. Ethan told us, he said you had a business. I do, I said. Would you like to see it? It wasn't a warm invitation. It was a statement of fact. A challenge. I didn't wait for an answer. I set my mug down and led them off the porch, starting the tour not at the house, but at the heart of the operation, the barn. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of ozone and damp earth. The hum of fans and pumps was a constant, gentle thrum. I watched their eyes widen as they took in the towering walls of green, the complex network of pipes and wires, the purple glow of the specialized LEDs. I walked them through the entire process, my voice calm and professional. I explained the gravity-fed irrigation system, the nutrient cycling, the software I had coded myself to monitor the light spectrum and pH levels. I showed them the current contracts on a whiteboard, the grocery chain, the restaurant supplier, a new deal with a meal kit delivery service. I spoke their language, not of love or approval, but of scalability, profit margins, and intellectual property. I saw the shift happen in my father first. The awkward discomfort in his posture began to straighten into something else. His investor's brain, the part of him I had always felt judged by, was kicking in. He stopped looking at it as his daughter's strange hobby and started seeing it as a viable enterprise. "What's your patent situation on this rotation system?" he asked. His voice sharp with genuine professional interest as he pointed to one of the towers. "I have a provisional patent filed," I answered. "My lawyer is drafting the full utility application now." He nodded, impressed despite himself. We moved from the barn to the fields, where I was testing larger scale, soil-based applications of my vertical designs. He bent down, something I had never seen him do, and picked up a handful of the rich, dark soil. He crumbled it between his fingers. Then he reached out and touched the leaf of a kale plant. His touch surprisingly gentle. He was looking, really looking, at what I had created. My mother remained mostly silent throughout the tour, her face a pale, unreadable mask. But I could see her taking in the details, the happy, focused employees who greeted me by name, the beautiful, sturdy fence I'd had installed, the sheer, undeniable reality of it all. When the tour was over, I led them back to the farmhouse porch. We sat in the new rocking chairs I'd bought, the silence between us heavy with everything that had been shown but not said. And then, my mother began to cry. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a silent, heartbreaking, weeping, tears streaming down her face as she stared out at the fields. My father awkwardly placed a hand on her shoulder. "We were wrong," she finally whispered. Her voice choked. "We were so wrong." She turned to me, her eyes red and pleading. "We didn't understand. Bailey, your path, it wasn't the one we had laid out. It scared us. And when people are scared, they say cruel things." She took a shuddering breath. "We called you a failure. And we were wrong." My father cleared his throat, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "Your mother is right," he said, the words sounding clumsy and foreign in his mouth. "We wanted to make it right." He reached into his jacket, the same motion he had used at Ethan's party, and pulled out an envelope. He placed it on the small table between us. "It's a check for $230,000 on equivalent gift to help you expand." There it was, the moment of truth, the old me, the 32-year-old girl who had stood invisible in her brother's new house, would have wept with relief. She would have taken the check as a sign of absolution, as proof that she had finally earned her place. But I wasn't her anymore. I was the woman who had built this farm with her own 2 hands, with sleepless nights and borrowed money and a sheer, bloody-minded refusal to quit. I looked at the envelope, then at my parents' hopeful, anxious faces, and I felt nothing. The desperate need for their approval, the gaping wound that had defined so much of my life, had healed over. It was a scar now, a part of my history, but it no longer ached. I pushed the envelope gently back towards them. "I don't need your money," I said, my voice quiet but firm. I looked my father in the eye. I promised Grandma Eleanor that I would follow my heart. I kept that promise. This place. I gestured to the farm around us. This is the result of that promise. I built this myself. They looked stunned, confused. Their only tool for fixing things, their money, had been refused. The power dynamic had just shifted, permanently, and we all felt it. But that doesn't mean it can't be used for good. I continued, a new idea blooming in my mind. Born of the moment. Let's use it to start something new. Let's establish the Eleanor Henderson Scholarship for Innovation in Sustainable Agriculture. We can use it to help other young women who have a passion that doesn't fit into a neat little box. We can use it to honor her. I was no longer the recipient of their largesse. I was directing it. I was inviting them to be a part of my world. On my terms. 6 months passed. The scholarship was established. And the process of working on it together began a slow, fragile healing. My family began to tentatively re-enter my life. Not as owners, but as guests. Ethan started visiting on weekends. He'd show up in old jeans and spend hours helping me in the fields. His hands getting dirty. A genuine, unburdened smile on his face. He was finding a piece of himself here. Away from the pressure of our father's world. My mother would visit. Too. Always bringing a peace offering, a homemade pie. A book she thought I'd like. We started to talk again. About small things at first. Rebuilding the burned bridges one careful plank at a time. My father remained reserved. But he started sending me articles about new irrigation technologies or breakthroughs in soil science. With a short, typed note. Saw this. Thought of you. It was his way of saying he was trying. One evening, they all came for dinner. It was the first time we had been together as a family at my home. On my farm. The air was still a little awkward. A little fragile. But underneath it, there was a new current of warmth. We ate at a large wooden table I had built myself, with vegetables grown just 100 feet away. Towards the end of the meal, my father raised his glass. I want to make a toast, he said. And we all fell silent. He looked directly at me. I spent my life measuring success by the standards I understood, he said. His voice heavy with a lifetime of certainty, now made uncertain. Stock prices. Promotions. The size of a house. It limited my ability to see other forms of meaningful achievement. He looked around at the warm light of the dining room. At the fields visible through the window. I'm proud of you, Bailey. Of what you've built here, and of the woman you've become. After they left, I walked out onto the porch and into the cool night air. The moon was high and bright, silvering the leaves of the crops in the fields. A profound sense of peace washed over me, deeper and more satisfying than any applause. The validation was nice, I realized, but it was secondary. It was the dessert, not the meal. The real prize was this feeling. Right here. Right now? The quiet strength that came from living a life that was authentically, unapologetically my own. I had followed my heart, just as I had promised, and it had led me home.